Good morning, church. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will preach the message from Matthew 5, 3 to 10. I'm Isaiah Tabalbag, and I will read in English.
I am Andrew Tabalbag, and I will read in Mandarin. Hear the word of the Lord. 虚心的人有福了，因为天国是他们的；哀痛的人有福了，因为他们必得安慰；温柔的人有福了，因为他们必承受地土。
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth.
饥渴慕义的人有福了，因为他们必得饱足；怜恤人的人有福了，因为他们必蒙怜恤；清心的人有福了，因为他们必得见神。
Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God.
使人和睦的人有福了，因为他们必称为见的儿子；为义受逼迫的人有福了，因为天国是他们的。
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is the word of the Lord.
We're going to continue looking at the Sermon on the Mount because it is such a transformative message that Jesus gave, and also one that we should really know. We should really understand the Sermon on the Mount. If any sermon that you've ever heard in your life, you should be able to say, I get this, I get it. Sermon on the Mount is really one of them. I do want to kind of share the context in which I prepared this sermon because I do think it's maybe important to point out. This past week, the staff and some of our members were at a conference called the Christian Community Development Association. Just basically national gathering of people who are serving the poor and seeking justice and developing communities in some really incredible and sacrificial ways. 3,000 of us together, just hearing encouraging, amazing, and incredibly challenging messages for people who are in that kind of environment. I also didn't sleep as much as as a conference. I shared a room with someone besides my wife, which was a little strange for me after so many years. Me and Derek shared a room, and I think we both woke each other up with our snoring. I'm pretty sure, Derek, I didn't tell you that, but I'm telling you that now, and you can tell me that later. So not as much sleep as usual, but also when you're in a context where everyone is going hard and talking about really challenging things, and then you're trying to write a sermon, it's hard to write a sermon separate from that context. It's I don't know, you're really, everyone's so passionate about it. You're I'm writing a sermon about everything you're saying right now. I feel a little bit like that. I remember when I was in seminary, my congregation members would often say, I think you're living in a different reality than we're living in right now. And so I just want to point that out. I was at a conference. It was intense. And so if this sermon is intense and, really fiery, it might be partly that. Or it might just because it's the way it is. So throughout this sermon, I might be saying, does this make sense? It's not a rhetorical thing. I'm literally asking you, does this make sense? Or am I just kind of sleep deprived and getting a little sick and I don't know if this really actually makes sense. But I hope it does. I hope you can't track with this and that this does kind of come together in the end. So in order to understand the Sermon on the Mount, which again is really key for us, we should understand this sermon. One phrase or one idea that we kind of have to have a grasp on is the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven. We saw it kind of bookending the Beatitudes, right? The beginning and the end of the Beatitudes has the kingdom of heaven in it. The Lord's Prayer, the dead center of it is the kingdom of heaven, right? Let your kingdom come, that your will be done. And so in order to understand the Sermon on the Mount, we have to have some understanding of this idea of the kingdom of heaven. The book of Luke refers to it as the kingdom of God, but it's really the same kind of idea, right? So to understand this pivotal sermon, we have to understand this idea, which is the kingdom of heaven. The problem being this, both the word kingdom and heaven are not really that familiar to us. We don't use those words really in like kind of everyday conversations. It's not really ideas that we spend a lot of time thinking about. I was thinking about it for myself. When I think about the word kingdom, I have some strange images that come to mind. I think about Disney, number one. I don't know if that's for anyone else, but it kind of just sticks in my mind. Or I think about movies like this movie with Orlando Bloom, Kingdom of Heaven, if any of you guys have seen that. Or Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, more recently, if you've maybe seen that movie. And then trying to understand the kingdom of heaven based off these images is not really helpful. But this is what comes to my mind, is things like this. This is what the kingdom is. And I'm like, I don't really know what that means. Or if you even think about the word heaven, like you think about like really good food, or you're on vacation or something, I'm in heaven right now. And so you put those words together and you say, that the kingdom of heaven is theirs, and it really is a little confusing. And so this is kind of the problem, that we have this key idea, but we don't understand it very well. They're not very familiar to us, these words and concepts, and oftentimes it feels very disconnected. It feels very isolated, like we're just talking about heaven coming to earth, or us going to heaven. It's really cloudy and harps, all those different images that come to mind. And so what does it mean? How do we make sense of this idea of the kingdom of heaven? It is pretty complex. Jesus himself would have to use as many metaphors, or we would call them parables, as possible to help us understand this, right? When you go through the Gospels, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a field, it's like a treasure, it is like people going to work. He uses everything that's possible to help us understand this divine reality that he knew and he saw, but no one else had. So it's hard. This is not easy to do, right? And so it's a complex thing to be able to understand this key idea that's so important, but is also mysterious in a lot of ways. I'm going to introduce one way to understand the kingdom of heaven, and that is to see it in relationship to the kingdoms of earth. It's kind of the natural thing that if someone says, hey, let's talk about the kingdom of heaven, kind of what naturally comes out of extension out of that is that in comparison to the kingdoms of this world or the kingdoms of earth. And I think that's what people would have heard as they hear about the kingdom of heaven. They'd naturally think about the kingdoms that they know about all around them. And so that's what I want to do. I don't want to talk about the kingdom of heaven in isolation as this idea that's up in the sky. And actually, some translations of the Bible actually talk about the kingdom of heaven as the kingdom of the skies, because that's really what it means. I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to look at the kingdom of heaven as an analog to the kingdoms here on earth. Right? That those two things can be understood as we look at both of them. And so that's one way to understand the kingdom of heaven. One way to better understand the kingdom of heaven is to see it as a comparison to other kingdoms, namely the kingdom of earth. Does that make sense? Kind of. Okay, that wasn't a very confident yes from some of us, but hopefully it'll make sense that understanding the kingdom of heaven, that maybe Jesus is comparing it to something else. Not just talking about it as an idea to itself, but as an analog or contrast to something else, namely the kingdoms that were around them. So what were the kingdoms of earth that people would have been familiar with? Really, there were two kingdoms that people knew of during that time, and that was the Roman Empire and the Herodians, or the Herodian kingdom. Okay, many of us probably know the Roman Empire, very famous. There's a lot of cable, shows about it, and very famous movies about it. Kind of the empire that ruled all of the area around the Mediterranean, very powerful, a lot of history around it. They were so big, this kingdom was so big, as large as the United States. So if you think about that area of the Roman Empire, it's as big as the United States is from coast to coast, contiguously. So huge. No, telephones, no telegraphs, ancient roads, but they controlled an area that large, which is pretty amazing. They couldn't control all that by themselves, and so what they would do is they would actually kind of use puppet kings or client kings to manage different provinces. And so Jerusalem was one of those places. They would call it Judea, and they couldn't control all of it. And so they basically hired a guy named Herod, or Herod the Great, a Jewish leader, to rule the province of Judea, which was called Jerusalem as well. Right? And that's the Herodians. And so these are the two kingdoms. When, if Jesus comes and talks about kingdoms, that's what has sprung to mind. They know the Romans, and they know the Herodians, this client king, Herod the Great. And so that's what they're thinking about when they hear this word, kingdoms, that's being spoken. And what's interesting about these kingdoms is not only that they understood them and that they saw it all around them, they had very common characteristics. They all kind of operated and looked similar in a lot of ways. And one thing that all the kingdoms of the world of that time demonstrated is that they glorified powerful individuals. They all ran because of really one person at a time. And when you even go through the history books, you can find these sculptures and these paintings of, let's say, Julius Caesar from the Roman Republic, so a powerful general who was assassinated because he had too much power. There was Herod the Great, who built a lot of the buildings in Jerusalem. So these powerful, influential, usually exceedingly rich people who controlled almost everything. And really, the most powerful person at that time was this guy named Caesar Augustus, who is that middle picture. Caesar Augustus was also named Octavian, and he was a general who kind of rose to power after Julius Caesar. And not only does he become powerful, he becomes the first emperor of the Roman Empire. And he doesn't just stop at emperor, because they actually create a cult of the emperor around him, and he becomes a Roman god. The Roman emperor would become part of the Roman pantheon with Zeus and I forget the rest. No, Zeus is the wrong one. That's Greek. Jupiter is the Roman one, right? He becomes a god. So not just glorifying individuals, deifying individuals. That's how these kingdoms ran. Powerful people that had so much more authority and power than anyone else, and sometimes would become gods unto themselves. And so they were very familiar with these powerful, glorified individuals. The kingdoms of the world operated that way. The other thing that people would have known of that time period is that the kingdoms of the world took wealth, territory, and resources from others for themselves. This is just how they operated. They would, not to be satisfied with what they had, they would invade other places, take their resources, and just bring it over to themselves. Perfect example is Rome. There's a series of maps that I'm showing you that show you where Rome starts. It doesn't start very large. If you look on the far left, Rome is just this little province on the peninsula of Italy. There's a lot of other provinces, a lot of other people, until they start to expand. And then they conquer their neighbors. And they continue to do that until they conquer that entire section in red that you see on the right. They don't ask for permission. These aren't treaties that they're making with these people. They gather their armies, they invade, and then they conquer these people and then take the resources. They would take the timber from Germany or olive oil from Greece, and they would just take these things and then bring them back to Rome. Perfect example of that is with the conquering of the temple in Jerusalem. They would actually take the spoils from that temple when they would conquer it in 70 AD. That's how they would build the Colosseum. So the Colosseum in Rome that you can see in Rome was built from the wealth of the temple. The gold from the temple that they stole, that's how they built the Colosseum. And in fact, there's this relief, there's this kind of sculpture there that shows them carrying a menorah on their shoulder out of the temple so they could build the Colosseum in Rome. This is how the kingdoms worked. They would just go into other people's places, say, hey, we're taking this. And they would take it back, and they would build their kingdom. They would also do that through taxation as well. There was huge taxes they would pay to both Rome and the Herodians. And the Herodians did the exact same thing. This is from a biblical historian who said this. The confiscation, so taking the wealth of the hostile Jewish upper classes, made Herod exceedingly rich and provided Herod with funds to pay for the continued goodwill of his Roman overlord, Mark Antony. This is just how the kingdoms of that time period work. They would invade places, take their wealth, and just say, it's ours. This is mine now, it's not yours. And they would hoard it, build bigger things, and just bigger storehouses for all of these things. The last aspect, the last characteristic of the kingdoms of the world that people would have known during that time period is that the kingdoms of the world ruled primarily through violence. That's just how they got everything done. Everything they did, whether it was enforcing their laws or invading other territories or getting a point across, communicating, whatever it was, their main tool of doing that whenever they wanted to was always violence. That's just how they got things done. A perfect and maybe gruesome example of this is the rebellion of Spartacus. The rebellion of Spartacus. Nowadays, most of us know Spartacus as a movie I'm dating myself. Who's seen the movie Spartacus? Kirk Douglas. Oh my gosh, actually, we got some older folks. And then there's also like cable shows that also are about Spartacus as well. And so we see him as a Hollywood character. It's actually a real historical character. Janice is like, oh, a real gladiator. That story is real. A real slave gladiator who rose up against the Roman Republic and almost defeated them. Created an army and almost defeated them, kind of ran around Rome, did these amazing like commando raids, like rappelling off mountains to come behind the army, just crazy, crazy stuff. Eventually they did lose. To punish Spartacus and to make a point to the people who would try to do this again, they used crucifixion. Crucifixion wasn't just for Jesus. They didn't, do that just to Jesus. It was a common Roman punishment to make a point, again, using violence. But they didn't just crucify Spartacus and the leaders. They crucified the army. The army. And so what they did is they lined the Appian Way, which is this major road going into Rome, with crucifixes, with miles and miles of crucifixes, to show everyone who is coming into Rome, don't do this. This is what we will do. This is how they got things done. This is how they enacted policy. This is how they invaded territory. It was always through violence. It was always their main tool. King Herod was no different, even as a client king. And we know this from the Bible, from something called the Massacre of the Innocents. We talk about that during the Advent season, but Herod hears that a Messiah is going to be born in the town of Bethlehem. In order to prevent that from happening, he would actually kill every boy under the age of 2 who lived in that town. And historians, they doubt that, and they say, we can't find any other proof of that happening, so it probably didn't happen. But any historian will tell you that Herod did kill his own wife, and he did kill several of his own children to prevent them from taking power. Do you think he would really care about other people's children? Would he have even blinked an eye? This is just how things worked. This is the reality that surrounded them, and it predated them. It went to the Babylonians. They would see it afterwards in the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This is the world that they knew. For the people of that era, when they heard kingdoms, they knew this for a fact. These weren't historical things that they read up in Wikipedia like I did. I had to do that just to let you know, right? They knew this because when they paid their taxes, they could see Caesar Augustus' face on it, or the face of Herod the Great. They knew this because their wealth was going to other places. They knew this because they were from other lands that had been conquered by the Romans. They knew this because when they passed by the hill of Golgotha, there would always be the crucifixes there with corpses hanging from them, and so they took them down. This was just the world that they knew. When they hear kingdoms, they think about powerful individuals. They think about the stolen wealth that they are giving up, and they are thinking about death and suffering. This is just the life that they lived in. That ultimately, the peoples of Jesus' era, they knew these things. Every person listening to Jesus understood the ways of the kingdom of the world because they lived and died under their rule. So this is kind of what we see. Sorry, my notes are all out of order. And there's no pages on here either. Good job. Does this make sense? It's not making sense to me right now. All right, we'll figure it out. So this is kind of what they know. They hear the word kingdom, and they understand these things. They live and die under these things every single day. And then something happens. Then this guy named Jesus comes out of nowhere. He's talking about kingdoms as well. He'll start referring to kingdoms, but he talks about a kingdom of heaven instead, because in Matthew chapter 4, his very first words of public ministry, at least in the Gospel of Matthew, are this: repent, for the kingdom of heaven is drawing near. This is different. He's saying, okay, a kingdom, but a different kingdom. And then what he'll do is he'll talk about a kingdom that is different from the world in every single way. That in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus describes a kingdom that is the opposite of the kingdom of this world pretty much in every single way possible. For example, the kingdoms of the world glorify the powerful, right? But the kingdom of heaven centers the meek, the persecuted, and the peacemaker. Again, think about this. The people gathered there, they know kingdoms, and they know the kings of the kingdom. They know about Caesar Augustus. They know about Herod the Great. They know all of these names. And then Jesus said, let me talk to you about a kingdom. And in this kingdom, blessed, maybe centered, powerful, are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Can you kind of see how confusing this must have been to the people of that time? Because when they hear kingdom, they hear about kings, they hear about powerful people who take everything. And instead, Jesus says, let me tell you about this kingdom of heaven, which is all about the poor. And it's about the humble. And it's about those who are persecuted. And the peacemaker instead. And you can almost kind of hear people's jaw drop as they hear about this kingdom. But he goes on and talks about another difference when he says this. The kingdoms of the world hoarded territory and wealth for themselves. And the kingdom of heaven shares the abundance of God's provision. Again, they know about kingdoms, and they know about the wealth that they give to the Herodians and to the Romans. And they know about their home villages being overrun and sending all their resources to these other countries. They know about living under that reality. And then Jesus talks about a kingdom as well. When he talks about that kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount, he says this, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, which was a policy of the Roman soldiery, they were able to force people to do that. Go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Even before Jesus would say these things, John the Baptist, who also brought a message of the kingdom of heaven, would say this. What should we do then? The crowd asked. John answered, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none. Anyone who has food should do the same. And again, you see how different this is from the kingdoms that people knew and they lived and they breathed in and they lived and died under. These kingdoms would steal wealth and accumulate it in storehouses and in temples and these big palaces. And instead, this kingdom of heaven would say the opposite. Don't hoard it. Share it. If you have it, borrow it out. Don't think twice about it. It's not yours anyway. It's the complete opposite. Another difference between these kingdoms is this. The kingdoms of the world ruled through violence, but the kingdom of heaven rejects violence and embraces peace. Again, in this time period, they could see Roman soldiers walking through the streets of Jerusalem. They saw, maybe not those people, but they could see crucifixes, not on the Appian Way, but all around them. Anytime this kingdom wanted to do something, they would threaten you with lashes or with a sword or with the death of all the people you knew. They would salt the earth so that no one could eat in that region again. If you guys know the history of Hannibal, that's what they would do. They defeated the army of Hannibal, and then they salted the field to say, may you all starve for generations afterwards. This was a tool that they knew the kingdoms would wield. And then Jesus would talk about this kingdom instead. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. So now we begin to see the kingdom of heaven. There's these ideas in the Sermon on the Mount that we've heard over and over about, about exalting the poor and the meek and the humble, about sharing wealth and about being peacemakers. We kind of see them in isolation, but we see they're not isolated, are they? They are a direct comparison and a contrast, a conflict with the ways of the world of that time period. Does that make sense? This is not just like, oh, look at these amazing ideas. Let me just give you these ideas. He is fighting with the ways of this world, point to point, one point to the other. Everyone could have seen the differences between the kingdoms that they lived in and the kingdom of heaven that Jesus was talking about. And so this helps us to understand what the kingdom of heaven really is. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, it is not a disconnected idea or concept. It is a direct rebuke to the ways of the kingdom of the world and an invitation to a new way of living, thinking, and acting instead. You see, very often when we hear the kingdom of heaven, we start thinking about the Bugs Bunny understanding of heaven, or Tom and Jerry. You ever guys remember that? Where like, I don't know, Bugs Bunny, or usually like Tom and Jerry, like they die and then they go to heaven and they like strum the harp and those kind of things. And so we tend to think about the kingdom of heaven as that kind of isolated idea, very disconnected from the world, disconnected from politics, disconnected from anything that is happening. What I'm trying to tell you is that it was not. That when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, people couldn't help but give the side eye to the kingdoms of this world. They couldn't help but be reminded of their violence and the resources and the glorification, the deification of people. They looked sideways and said, but what about this? It was connected to these realities. So when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, he is also calling out the kingdoms of this world. He's saying, we're not this way. This is not our kingdom. And he's calling people, don't live like that. He's not just saying, yeah, be isolated, just be kind of these really good people. He's saying, be these really good people, be these heavenly people, and stand in prophetic opposition to the ways of this world. It is not a divorced Bugs Bunny, do your harp thing. It is very connected to this world. It's supposed to be a proclamation. We are not like this world, and the ways of this world are not our ways. It is very concrete. It is very real. It is very conflicted. When you read it the way people saw it, they heard the conflict and they would kill Jesus for that conflict. You think if Jesus was just talking about something pie in the sky that people would have cared? People of the time, the kings of the time, saw this as a threat to them directly. And that's why they would kill him. It's because they knew they were talking about them. The kingdom of heaven talks about the kingdoms of the world, and it puts it under the microscope and it says, this is not our way. That's what the kingdom of heaven does. That's what Jesus was doing. He wasn't just painting a picture of the world to come, although he is, and that's not wrong in any way. He's also putting the ways of this world under a microscope and saying, that is not your way. We stand in opposition. This kingdom stands in conflict and in opposition with the ways of this world. That's what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. And the question is, what about us? So what do we do about the Sermon on the Mount? Well, I think one thing we have to recognize is this. The kingdoms of Jesus' age are no different from the kingdoms of our own. I mean, we just took a long time to talk about the history of the Mediterranean, Caesar Augustus, these demagogue, deified leaders, stealing resources, fighting over territories, right? Expanding, all those kinds of things. And how do they do it? They use violence, right? Wow, the Romans and Spartacus and Hannibal and all these kind of old things. Go look in your newspaper right now and tell me that the world is any different. You go to the South China Sea right now, and there's a conflict that's brewing that might spark something broad. That's what military commanders in the United States think, that it might come out of the South China Sea. What is the South China Sea? This rich coastal waters in between the Philippines and China that they're beginning to fight over right now. And they're colliding ships with right now. And that is happening because of these leaders who are saying, this is ours. No, this is ours. And they're on the brink of war because of it. What is the Ukraine except the breadbasket of Europe, feeding how many millions of people? And then you have these demagogue people, these people who have been in power for decades at a time, who are taking it over for themselves so that they can have that territory instead. Gaza is also about territory, about cutting people up and grabbing territory and isolating people from one another and using military force to do that. Politicians and presidents and premiers, and they may not be called Caesar Augustus, they may not be a cult of emperor, but there are still cults of personality out there. And they're still fighting over territory, and they're still grabbing it for themselves, and they're still using not swords, but they'll use guided missiles and drones and the same force of arms to do the same exact things. Nothing has changed. This world is the same. We sanitize it. We've got democracy going. We've got United Nations, but the fundamental character is exactly the same. Everything is happening in the same way. These powerful, 100% rich individuals who are telling us to grab resources from other people and hoard it because we don't have enough. And we do it by blowing people up. The kingdoms of this world have not changed at all. What that means then is that our calling hasn't changed at all either. Like he did on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is calling us to live in a way that stands in prophetic opposition to the kingdoms of the world in our age. That's what he was doing on the first day he preached the Sermon on the Mount. He wasn't just saying, hey, here's heaven, it's really cool. He's saying, this is heaven, look at it, and tell me this does not look different from the kingdoms of this world. Everyone would have seen it that time period. And they need to see the same thing in us to this day. The same calling that each of us have right now. That when people see Christians, they say, there's a different kingdom. They can see this kingdom, and they know how different it is from this world. Our calling remains the same, to stand in prophetic opposition, that people might see the kingdom of heaven through us. Yes. There are questions that come with this. Are we living in a way that resists violence and promotes peace? Locally, not just, it's hard to, what can we do in Ukraine? Those are things that kind of are difficult, but we can do that locally. We can do that in our neighborhoods in a way that resists and pushes back on the ways of this world and say, that's not my way. That's not the kingdom's way. Are we amassing our treasures here on earth? Or are we instead investing in treasures in heaven? Are we giving freely? Because none of us are going to take the stuff that we've got into heaven. Not one of us. So where are we amassing our treasures? Here on earth or in heaven? Another question of the kingdom is this: are we centering our attention on the humble, the persecuted, and the peacemaker? Again, this is election season. Our eyes are going to pulpits, they are going to podiums, they are going to these incredibly powerful individuals. We shouldn't take our eyes from the people who are down low, people who have no voice. That's the kingdom. Those are the people who are blessed in the kingdom, are those who are persecuted and the peacemaker instead. Calling is the same, is to stand and to live and to breathe in prophetic opposition to the same kingdoms of the world that work the same way. There's one more contrast between the kingdoms of the earth and the kingdom of heaven that I want to encourage us with, and that is this: to recognize the kingdoms of this world are only temporary. Yes. They're only temporary. Right. There is this poem. I don't think I've ever read a poem in 10 years of ministry here, but I'm going to read a poem, and it's called Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. I actually memorized this at one point in time when I was younger. I don't trust my memory, so I'm just going to read it. But it's really powerful, and so it says this: I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear: my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. Poetry's weird. It's hard to understand. What he's saying here is that there is this king of that time period who erected this massive statue of himself. And on the pedestal it says, look at what I have made and despair. Look at all the things that I have created and see how great I am. And then thousands of years later, a person comes upon the statue and he sees nothing. There is nothing there. There is just sand, because it's all been buried. It's all wrecked. The winds have eroded it and just tossed it away. That's all that's left of this mighty person who thought his name would stand for thousands of years. He's just as forgotten as a peasant that he overturned. That's just a powerful, powerful image. I've been thinking about Rome. Anyone been to Rome before? Some of us have. I would love to be at Rome. You can go to Rome, and you can continue to see, some of the things that the Romans have, erected. The only reason they're there is because we keep on rebuilding them? That the people of Rome continue to invest millions of dollars to make sure the Colosseum does not fall apart so that people would go there and keep on looking at it? That's the only reason it stands up, is because we prop it up. Rome is only there because we don't want to lose it. But if we left it, it would just crumble into nothingness. It's there under the modern roads of that city, are the incredible work that they have made. Every empire, every kingdom that ever existed and will ever exist will end up the same way as Ozymandias. Even the United States. We did not always exist. We will not always exist. I don't know what happens afterwards. Maybe something better, maybe something worse. But this is a pathway of every kingdom. Kingdoms are only temporary. Compare this now with the revelation of John in John 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." This is the kingdom of heaven, timeless, eternal. And the question that I think that we're presented with when we hear about the kingdom, the choice that we are called to make is this: which kingdom will we represent? Which kingdom will we represent? The kingdoms of Romans, of the Americans, of Ozymandias, that try to establish, that lift up these people and take all these resources and hold them and say, "We're taking this because it's ours. And if you come after us, we'll kill you." Or will we be this part of this timeless kingdom, this eternal kingdom, where every tear will be wiped away and death will not be a thing anymore, and that God will be amongst us? Which kingdom will we represent now when we hear about this kingdom of heaven? Which will people see in us? The kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of earth? That's the challenge that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount, and I think it's the same challenge that we are given here today. I'm just going to ask to bow our heads for a moment. Worship team, if you want to come forward. And I just kind of want us to sit with this in silence for just a second. Again, so often when we hear about the kingdom of heaven, we hear about it as this kind of divine coming reality, that Jesus is coming and heaven is going to look this way. And it feels just like something we look forward to. But again, I hope it makes sense. I hope what I said makes sense. He's also talking about the here and now. And he talks about the kingdom of heaven as a lens through which we look at this world, as a lens through which we examine this world, and a lens through which we can contrast and say the kingdom of heaven is not like the kingdoms of this earth. And if that's true, the kingdom of heaven is not just something we look forward to, it's something that we live out now, today. Yes. In South Seattle, in Kent, in Burien, whatever it is, we have an obligation to stand in alignment with the kingdom of heaven and to stand in opposition from the kingdoms of the world here and now. And my question is, how are you going to do that? How am I going to do that? Jesus, how can I do that so that people see me or they see my life and where I invest my time and my resources and where my wealth is? They would see the kingdom of earth and they would see which side I am on. which citizen I am a kingdom of. Which flag is draped in front of my front porch? Which acronym will I use? Holy Spirit, speak to us right now. Yes. To see the kingdom of heaven as a challenge to this world and a challenge to us. And you are calling to each of us, this is my kingdom. You are a citizen of my kingdom. Stand up. Live according to my kingdom. Jesus, do that right now, I pray. As we hear the words, the kingdom of heaven, may it not be isolated and divorced. May it not be something that just is in the future. May we see it as a rebuke to the way this world has worked time and time again, and a call for us to prophetically live and proclaim the kingdom of heaven instead, in word and deed and action, in wealth and in poverty, and in all that we do. That is what you meant when you proclaim the kingdom of heaven. Do that now in us, God. God, we're going to give the offering. And the offering is another moment for us to do that. It's another moment for us to do what you told us in the Sermon on the Mount, is that if we have 2 cloaks, give up one of them. Yeah. Don't think about borrowing out to anyone else, because we're citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Right. We serve the God who is the Lord of 1,000 hills. God, help us even in this offering to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven, we pray. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.